Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 448, and I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Today is October 23rd, 2025. A lot to talk about on today's show. I want to jump right into it. Just a couple things first. One, I've been, trying to mix up the format of the show just a little bit. So if you have any comments on that, leave them in the comment section on the YouTube page. Your feedback is going to help me kind of, decide what I want to do with this show and how to direct it, and what's the best way going forward to engage the audience and make a product that you all want to listen to and share, and everything like that. Additionally, the Kyle Anzalone show has been pretty great this week. I had Scott Horton on Monday, Colonel Douglas McGregor on yesterday, and upcoming tomorrow is Lieutenant Colonel Karen Kwiatkowski. So I am very excited about all the episodes that I am putting out for you guys this week. So if you haven't already, subscribe to the Kyle Anzalone Show. It's the first link in the show notes page. And with that, let's get rolling on today's news. All right, starting off with the Caribbean, and actually now the Pacific as well. Updates on bombing drug boats. U.S. bombs boat near Colombian waters. I wrote this one for JudgeNap.com on October 22nd. And so now the U.S. has carried out at least 7 strikes on drug boats in the Caribbean, or on alleged drug boats in the Caribbean, I should say. There's no evidence that any of these ships were carrying drugs. And now they've carried out one of these strikes in the Pacific, just outside of Colombian waters. And, this is interesting that this has expanded to Colombia. In a sense, I wonder if the White House is calculating that they need to give themselves a little bit legitimacy and not make it look like they're just trying to carry out a regime change operation in Venezuela. All the data shows the vast majority of drugs that come into the United States are coming through Pacific waterways and not the Caribbean, which means that it's definitely not the Venezuelans and the Colombians, the Ecuadorians, the Peruvians who are bringing the drugs into the United States. Now, of course, a lot of drugs also come via land through Mexico, and that's where they are getting mixed up with fentanyl, which, as Trump has said, we're worried about the drugs that are killing Americans. I really don't think they're worried about the drugs coming from the cocaine, the little amount of cocaine that's coming through Colombia, because it's not mixed with the fentanyl. Cocaine addiction is destructive. I'm not saying that it's great that people are addicted to cocaine, but if you are looking at the drugs that are killing people and the most problematic, it is the drugs that are coming through Mexico that are mixed with the fentanyl, not the drugs that are coming through Venezuela. And so, interesting, I think it was the 6th or 7th strike on a drug boat in the Caribbean. There are actually 2 survivors. Now, both of these men, I believe, at least one, I believe both, were returned to Ecuador, which is the country that they are from. One is still in the hospital. I don't know how significant the injuries are. The story I read kind of made it sound like he really hasn't been interviewed or talked to, so my guess is the extent of the injuries are somewhat serious. Of course, you're able to survive a strike and get to land, and so maybe that added to the what happened when they were on the boat. But the man that wasn't in the hospital was actually released without charges. They found no criminal wrongdoing. Now, maybe the Ecuadorian government's corrupt. Maybe, however, they made this determination was just meant to be like an insult or a slap in the face to Donald Trump. They let a low-level drug offender go, and it makes it look like the U.S. isn't bombing drug boats in the Caribbean. But the boats that they're bombing in the Caribbean are just fishing vessels and people cruising around on the water for whatever reason. I don't know. And so this to me would make it seem like there's really no good. The U.S. hasn't produced any good evidence, and there's no reason to believe these are actual drug boats. It is interesting that this 8th strike that came off of the Colombian waters comes after the Colombian president has increasingly irked President Donald Trump. Most recently, he has been very hard and broken free trade agreements and slammed the Israeli government over their genocide in Gaza and their crackdown on and arrest and detention of the flotilla activists who are attempting to bring food to the starving Palestinians in Gaza. So important story there. Next up here, this is really huge. Trump lifts restriction on Ukraine's use of Western missiles for long-range attacks inside of Russia. This is a story I wrote up for the Libertarian Institute on October 22nd. So Wednesday afternoon, we get this breaking story from the Wall Street Journal that they talked with U.S. officials who said that the Trump administration lifted a key restriction on Ukraine's use of some long-range missiles provided by Western allies, enabling Kiev to step up attacks on targets inside Russia and increase pressure on the Kremlin. The article goes on to explain that Ukraine would not be able to conduct these attacks without the American intelligence, which gives the Americans the power to veto any of these attacks. So all of these attacks are effectively approved by Washington. Now, one interesting note to all of this is the Wall Street Journal says that this restriction appears to have been lifted as the decision-making, the approval and decision-making for U.S. passing intelligence for long-range Ukrainian strikes using Western-made missiles into Russia from Secretary of Defense Secretary of War Pete Hegseth in the Pentagon to U.S. European Command. I believe that's based in Germany. And so it seems that maybe there's a little bit more European influence over it, or the commander there, forget his name, is just more pro-Ukrainian than Pete Hegseth is and is willing to approve these strikes. It also comes after we had the report, which did seem to be confirmed, that the U.S. had also approved giving intelligence to Ukraine for Ukraine using their own, put this in air quotes, domestically produced drones, right? Like the CIA is helping them, the Europeans are helping them. These aren't like drones that are solely produced through Ukrainian supply chains. These are drones that are set up in Ukraine, and so they slap a Ukrainian flag on them probably, but there's no real indication to me that these weren't only developed with CIA information with the help of at least European, if not also American arms producers that allows Ukraine to assemble and use these drones. So I guess two more notes on this. Trump denied it. He said that this isn't true. There was a British Storm Shadow missile that hit a Russian plant on Tuesday, and so that would suggest that this is all correct. Now, I want to try to explain how this all kind of works into Trump's Ukraine policy. It's not an effective policy, but I do think I could explain it in a way where it doesn't seem as random as it seems to many in public. And so this is the art of the deal. Trump is trying to pressure the Russians publicly to make a deal with the Ukrainians. Trump is, I think, trying to adopt a more conciliatory tone to the Ukrainians in public, and there may be some good strategy for this as far as domestic politics go. The harsher Trump is with Zelensky, the more there's going to be hyperventilating among the U.S. establishment, mainstream media, and elites of, oh my God, Trump loves Vladimir Putin. And so I'm sure that kind of position tamps down on that. And then, Trump's goal here is to get these two sides to come together and make a deal. The problem with that is the Russians understand this. They understand that when Trump is talking about providing long-range munitions to Ukraine, or even these other steps, that, President Biden had allowed Ukraine to use ATACMS and Storm Shadows to hit targets inside of Russia. Trump reversed that at the beginning of his administration. Now he's gone back on that. The long-range drone strikes isn't something that Biden wanted to do. They announced new sanctions. I wrote this up for JudgeNap.com on Wednesday. Trump announces what he called tremendous sanctions on Russia's two largest oil firms. They sanctioned those companies. But these aren't going to have a major impact, and Russia understands this, and Russia understands that Trump isn't going to escalate and give the Ukrainians Tomahawk missiles. And so they understand the art of the deal. They understand the game that Trump is playing. I don't think Zelensky does whatsoever. And That's the problem, is because if your ally is getting the wrong signal from the message you're trying to send to Russia, it's going to make the Ukrainians less likely to negotiate. And with the Ukrainians less likely to negotiate, Trump is actually less likely to come to an end to this war. And while Trump has been, I think, willing, at least we saw in a recent meeting, to have some pretty tough words for Zelensky, it's not it's not enough to kind of squash this problem. Now, one more article on the Russia subject here. This one was an article I wrote Tuesday for the Insta. So last week, of course, we had Donald Trump speak with Putin, post on True Social that the two of us are going to meet very soon in Hungary. And then the White House comes out and says they have no plans for a Trump-Putin meeting. The White House official explained that Rubio spoke with the Russian Foreign Minister, Secretary of State, and National Security Advisor Marco Rubio, one of, if not the most powerful man in the White House when it comes to foreign policy influence, spoke with Lavrov, and the message conveyed to Trump, and what Lavrov said too, was that the Russian position is unchanged. And so the White House then assessed that there's no point in going through with this meeting if they're basically just going to rehash what was said at Alaska. So that's some disappointing news. Talking is always good, even if you don't think there's any room for success. It's probably worth it for the two sides to have the conversation. North Korea fires multiple short-range missiles. Wrote this one up for the Institute on Wednesday. And so the South Koreans, at the time I wrote this up, the North Koreans had not issued a statement on this. And the South Koreans were the ones who reported that North Korea fired multiple short-range ballistic missiles launched northeastward at 8:10 a.m. I think they are fired from kind of southern North Korea up, like almost more in the direction of Russia or China, not necessarily towards South Korea or Japan, but into the East Sea or the Sea of Japan. So this is North Korea's first missile test in 5 months, and my guess is that Pyongyang did this because they want to be at least a part of the conversation at the upcoming international summit of world leaders in South Korea. Trump is expected to meet with Xi there. Of course, the South Korean leader will be there, and multiple other world leaders will be there. And so North Korea wants to be a topic of conversation while Trump is in South Korea. The North Koreans have adopted a fairly, I think, firm position on what it will take to negotiate and make a deal with the Americans. They want the U.S. to drop the demand that North Korea denuclearize. I don't think that's going to happen now, as long as Marco Rubio is the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. So this may be a miscalculation on the North Korean part, drawing more attention to North Korea if the Americans aren't willing to negotiate. I don't think is a solid strategy. If I were the North Koreans, I would only do these kind of provocations and try to get on Trump's radar if you think that Trump is prepared to engage in negotiations. It doesn't at this point seem that is the case. All right, Gaza news. We got quite a bit of it surrounding the deal. So, of course, earlier in the week, there was this explosion in Rafah, which Israel initially said this was caused by Hamas. They conducted, I think even they said, multiple attacks, fired RPGs at an Israeli bulldozer. And the Israelis came in and they just started bombing the crap out of Gaza again, and killed, I think, few dozen people, over 80, I think close to 100 Palestinians now have been killed in about the 2 weeks the ceasefire has been in effect. So hasn't really been much of a ceasefire for the people in Gaza. Of course, that's less. The number of people that Israel killed over the past 2 weeks is the number of people they typically kill in a day. And so people will point to that and say, see, Israel is slowing down the rate of killing. The problem is that when you're still killing, it prevents life in Gaza from returning to normal or getting any better for the people there. So this is a problem. And now the other thing going on here, actually, let's do this story first. So in response to that, Trump sends Vance, Witkoff, Kushner to Israel, and Vance says, hey, look, this is going better than we thought. We can't believe this is holding well. I'm pretty optimistic about what's happening here. Quite unbelievable statements to make just after Israel completely violated the ceasefire, but it did seem that the Americans conveyed to the Israelis that they knew that Hamas didn't attack their bulldozer. They knew that bulldozer hit an unexploded Israeli bomb that was buried in the rubble of the house the bulldozer was trying to flatten, and that's what caused the explosion. This message was conveyed. The Israelis have returned to a slower level of killing in Gaza. So, Vance's remarks are interesting. That Trump sent Vance, Witkoff, Kushner to Israel is interesting, and does show that Trump is willing to invest some effort in keeping this ceasefire and peace deal alive. The problem is, if Israel does this every time there's an explosion of Gaza, look, and this time there wasn't even a Palestinian involved, but let's say that next time there is, that it's not even Hamas, it's just some guy whose 4 or 5 children have been killed, his wife's been killed, maybe his dad, a brother, hell, maybe even his brother was a member of Hamas and was somebody that Israel killed. Obviously, when you kill people's family members, a certain number of those people are going to seek vengeance on you. And there's unexploded bombs all over Gaza. So somebody figures out how to rig one of these bombs up into an IED. Maybe they stumble into a house where some members of Hamas were killed, or they left behind some arms as they were fleeing the Israelis, and they find some RPGs or some small rifles, and they use that to go out and kill some Israelis. Netanyahu is going to use each and every one of these events to return to the bombing and to try to break the ceasefire. I think eventually, if Trump is serious about getting this deal done, he will have to publicly rebuke not only Netanyahu, but the Israeli government. He will have to publicly leverage American military support, not just the aid, all military support to Israel, and say, if you do not stop, if you do not complete with the deal made by the great President Donald Trump, you will not ever get support from the Americans again. If Trump doesn't do that, then this ceasefire doesn't stick. And once he does that, he has to make it stick. He has to stand up to AIPAC. He's going to have to stand up to Ted Cruz and Lindsey Graham and all these hawks within his own party and some within his own administration. And that's why I think it's so unlikely that this deal is going to end up going through. Now, one other thing I will mention as a part of this article is J.D. Vance did publicly deliver a little bit of a message to the Israelis in his statement, saying that they need to have some patience when it comes to Hamas returning the bodies of the captives. And to all of us, this made sense. We know that the Palestinians are never going to recover all the bodies of the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that are dead and buried beneath the rubble of Gaza. Many of those bodies are just going to be lost. And Hamas may have some idea where most of these captives are. They may be able to get to some of the bodies over the course of weeks and months as they dig out, excavate tunnels, then, of course, do the very nasty work of separating the bodies, figuring out whose body is who. If somebody died in an airstrike, they may only be able to find parts or pieces, or if there was a fire, again, may only be able to find parts and pieces. The bodies may be very, very difficult to identify. And so this process is going to not just require Israel to take some patience, but to have some true understanding of the situation that they created in Gaza, and that it's going to take the Palestinians quite a bit of time to get the bodies out. Now, a second place where this ceasefire seems to be faltering is the inter-Palestinian violence. And this isn't something that should have been surprising to anybody who's been following this show, right? That there's inter-Palestinian violence. After all, this is a situation, again, that Israel created. They propped up different militias and also just allowed some to operate, right? And particularly Abu Shabab and the Dogma clan. And these two these two factions, particularly the Abu Shabab Popular Front forces, have ties to the Islamic State. And look, all the jails in Gaza have been, any place that Hamas would probably have had to store some Palestinian captives that they don't like are gone. And so Hamas is just killing these guys, either street executions or gun battles in the streets. And initially Trump said, well, we understand this has to happen. It made sense. And look, that's not to say I approve of it. I want Hamas to be carrying out summary executions, but I think it's possible to understand the situation in Gaza, the situation that Hamas is in, that this is the course of action that Hamas is going to take. And initially, Trump is like, all right. Now, Trump is saying we can't have this. And I'm guessing it's because the Israelis got in his ear. They were saying, oh, these are the good Palestinians. These are the Palestinians we like. You have to have Hamas stop this violence. And probably in part two, it doesn't look necessarily good to declare a ceasefire in Gaza and then have one of the parties to that ceasefire start carrying out summary executions in the street. I'm not sure what I would recommend to Hamas to do with these guys if they do capture them. I believe Abu Shabab himself was actually in a Gazan prison by Hamas before this all started, and won the airstrikes or chaos or something like that, and he was able to escape. And so if from Hamas's perspective, if trying to detain these men is just creating a problem for yourself in the future, this is war. This is a summary execution. These people were a part of the conflict, right? They were working and acting on behalf of the Israelis against Hamas. And maybe from Hamas's perspective, we didn't agree to a ceasefire with them. We agreed to a ceasefire with the Israelis. We're not attacking the Israelis. And so this just shows the level of complexity of the conflict and how Trump is unable to understand it. And I think that's going to prevent, again, this deal from being able to get to the finish line and fully ending the war. This article from Dave DeCamp I really just thought was worth taking a second to highlight. Witkoff reveals that CIA was telling him Hamas didn't want a ceasefire. And I think this says more that the CIA, or maybe Mossad, doesn't want a ceasefire. And this was the intelligence being funneled to the White House, maybe originating with the CIA, maybe originating with Mossad. We saw this with Iran, where the U.S. intelligence community had a position, a firm position, a sensible position, a position that actually reflected the reality of the situation when it came to Iran's nuclear program. Iran wasn't making nuclear weapons. They didn't have a nuclear weapon. The Ayatollah hadn't even ordered the creation of a nuclear weapons program in Iran. Then Mossad gets this intelligence and they start funneling it to Trump through Netanyahu, probably Ron Dermer's playing a role in getting it to other members of the administration, and also working it through the CIA and getting it into the White House that way. And this said Iran could have a nuclear bomb within 15 days. And suddenly, this is the position of the White House, of the intelligence community. Tulsi Gabbard even is repeating this nonsense. And so you do wonder if the U.S. intelligence in this region of the world is heavily influenced by Mossad. And this isn't some conspiracy, right? Ted Cruz was just on stage laughing and bragging about how, we give Israel $3.8 billion a year in military assistance, and they give us all this amazing intelligence. Israel gives the United States the intelligence that Israel wants the United States to have. And they give you a partial picture so that you look at that picture and you craft a policy based on that picture. That's not the reality. That's the reality that the Israelis want you to see. So I think that's very important when looking at this deal and understanding the decision making and the thinking in the White House. Talking about aid deliveries to Gaza, Israel has only allowed in a fraction of the agreed upon aid to enter Gaza since the ceasefire began. This one from our friend Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. And so this is a statement from the Gaza media office. We confirm that the total number of humanitarian aid trucks that have entered the Gaza Strip since the ceasefire began has reached 986 trucks out of the 6,600 trucks that were supposed to enter until Monday evening. So that's the first 11 days of the ceasefire. Israel is supposed to be allowing 600 trucks in a day. So that, obviously 6,600, 600 times 11 is 6,600. And they've only allowed in about 990 trucks. So if you divide that by 11, you get, I think, just like around 90, right? That's not a vast increase in aid into the Gaza Strip from what was happening before. The Palestinians are really getting nothing from this ceasefire. They gave up their hostages. They returned some of the bodies of the Israeli captives. Israel has released 1,700 Palestinians from detention. They released 250 Palestinians who were actually convicted of crimes. Some of them were probably guilty, some of them not. And they've returned the bodies of some Palestinian captives as well in pretty deplorable states and showing signs of beating, torture, potentially executions. So this is Israel is not complying with its half of the ceasefire. Now, the next part of all this isn't just the ceasefire that's currently in place, but as we talked about in the show, once the U.S. got word that Hamas was willing to release the Israeli captives, and that was only part of a phase one of a deal, they just rushed and got that through. And so that left some really important issues. Will Hamas disarm? And if Hamas does disarm, who's going to secure Gaza post-conflict? And then who's going to rule Gaza after the conflict? And my guess is that we're going to see Netanyahu do everything he can to drag his feet, to not engage in these talks. When he finally does engage in these talks, he's going to adopt outlandish hardline positions that even cut against Trump's 20-point agreement. And so one place is that Netanyahu has rolled out the involvement of Turkish or Qatari involvement in security forces in Gaza. Of course, Turkey, I believe, probably has the largest Muslim army, at least in the Middle East, if not the world. They have the second largest military in NATO. They have a very substantial military. So if you're talking about a country that has a lot of ample ground forces with some combat training and even some training in this kind of scenario, right? They did have a role in ceasefires in Syria when it came to, they were on the other side of the line of the Russians, and to their back were the jihadists. So I'm not making it out that this was some great policy, that these are good guys, but merely that they have experience in this kind of operation. So the Turks would be, I think, probably the most likely candidate. If something like this was going to happen, would be for Turkey to send their forces. Qatar is a very rich country, has a relationship with Hamas, as does Turkey, and again, would be probably one of the leading candidates if this were to happen, to send a security force to Gaza afterwards. And by taking the Turks and the Qataris out of it, Netanyahu is just making a deal more unlikely. Again, another place that a deal is more unlikely now than before, Israeli Knesset advances bill to annex the West Bank during Vance's visit. And so this goes to show that this is a nearly whole of Israeli government policy and not just a marginal position from Netanyahu, Itamar Ben-Gvir, and Bezalel Smotrich. A part of the 20-point peace plan did include an agreement that Israel would annex the West Bank. There, of course, I think it's very, very unlikely that Israel doesn't take steps to at least officially annex, not just de facto, but officially annex portions of the West Bank that would prevent the creation of a Palestinian state during Trump's administration. I think this is very, very likely scenario. I've been predicting it since even before Trump was elected. I said, if Trump gets elected, I think Israel is going to annex the West Bank. So this is should be problematic, should be a major red flag for the Americans. I'm wondering if the White House even knows it's happening or understands the implications of it. All right, last story up today has to do with Iraq. Rubio presses Iraq to disarm militias and call with the prime minister. And so you have the Shia militias of Iraq, and well, I believe some of them did exist before the rise of the Islamic State. The Shia militias really rose to prominence and gained a standing in Iraq and became a real meaningful fighting force in Iraq. after the invasion of the Islamic State and their capture of Mosul, Ramadi, to Crete. I don't remember. I think they got Fallujah too. Maybe they didn't take Ramadi. Maybe they took Tikrit and Fallujah. But they took major cities in Iraq. And when they were taking these cities, the Iraqi army that the U.S. government built absolutely crumbled and fled. And so these Shia militias were really the ones that were standing up and preventing this. And so these militias were so effective in fighting against ISIS, and they received support from the Iranians and even effectively the Americans. I don't want to call like the US and the Shia militias of Iraq necessarily like allies during the war against ISIS in Iraq during like 2014, 2015. But the U.S. was certainly carrying out airstrikes against the Islamic State that was helping the Shia militias. Now, at the same time, we were bombing the same groups when they were across the border in Syria. In Syria, they were fighting against the Islamic State, but we said, oh, that helps Bashar al-Assad, right? When you're fighting against the Islamic State on behalf of the central government of Iraq, well, that's the government of Iraq that America has a lot of influence over, and would have looked horrific for the Americans if Baghdad was overrun by jihadists just a few years after we built their government and military. With Syria, we were trying to facilitate the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad, so we wanted him weakened. And, Scott Horton would often joke that the U.S. chases the Shia militias across the Syria border with airstrikes, and then they're in Iraq, where now we're supporting them with airstrikes against the Islamic State. It was quite an insane policy on behalf of the U.S. Well, after they vanquished the Islamic State in Iraq, they're heroes. ISIS was like the most just apocalyptic, jihadist, torturous, murderous, thuggish, awful. Nobody wanted to live like that. Not even the Sunnis want to live under the Islamic State like that, right? And so Shia militias are heralded as heroes that saved Baghdad or major other Iraqi cities from falling to the Islamic State, and they gain a lot of influence in Iraq from that. Well, then the U.S. is pretty concerned about that because these militias were far more aligned with Iran than they were the Americans during that fight. And so now we have to take on the growing Iranian influence. And so we start conducting strikes against these groups, and they're conducting strikes back more so in Syria, where again, they're enemies with the Americans there, but we chase them and bomb them in Iraq as well. Once the genocide in Gaza starts, these Shia militias are one of the groups in the Middle East that have a lot to say and are very unhappy with that. And Israel starts to bomb them. They retaliate by rocket and drone strikes on American bases. 3 Americans end up killed at Tower 22 in Jordan. And, the U.S. steps up airstrikes, and eventually things cool off. I think it was in August of 2024 that things really started to cool off between the Shia militias and the Americans, but the Americans have been demanding that the Shia militias now disarm. Now, the Shia militias are demanding that the Americans leave Iraq, and I kind of wondered if maybe the Shia militias would disarm is probably a generous way of phrasing it, but they would integrate more in the Iraqi military. And even if this particular commander would only follow orders from certain Shia generals and not necessarily do whatever the prime minister in Baghdad said, they're no longer the popular mobilization forces or complete Hezbollah. They are integrated to some degree within the Iraqi army, and they were willing to do that. If the Americans left, the Trump administration called off the withdrawal, so I'm guessing we're not going to see any demilitarization of the Shia militias. My larger concern is if this is not just Rubio making some blanket statement, oh, I called the Iraqi prime minister, so I have to tell him that the Shia militias need to disarm, but this is a policy that the Trump administration is going to try to implement if possible by force. And it's not impossible that we see ourselves conducting strikes against the Shia militias again, in which case tensions and things could really ramp up in the Middle East. All right, everybody, that will do it for the show today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Remember to check out the Kyle Anzalone show today at 4:45 Eastern. I'm interviewing the great Lieutenant Colonel Karen Kwiatkowski.